The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Campbell. I am the Assistant Director for the National Adult Protective Services Association, and I am very happy to welcome you all to today's NAPSA's Regional Representatives Advisory Board webinar. So thank you all for being here and for listening in and participating with us today. Before getting into the topic and introducing our speaker, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping points, and we do have a couple of polls to get us started. So as far as housekeeping, all attendees are muted. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to write them in the questions box. When you join the webinar, you should have had a little side panel pop up on the right of your screen, and then there is an option in there that's labeled questions, and you can write those in there, and I'll see them throughout the presentation. If you have a technical question, I'll try to kind of type back a quick answer to you and help you out with that. And for content related questions, I'll hold those until the end to read them aloud for our presenter. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be posted at some point next week to NAPSA's website, and an announcement will be sent out to all those who registered for the webinar. So today we have Nora Baladarian with us to present regarding addressing capacity to consent to sex. Dr. Baladarian is a licensed psychologist, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and a board-certified forensic examiner. She has a private practice and is the director of the Disability and Abuse Project with Spectrum Institute. She also has authored various guidebooks and provided a variety of trainings, and we are very much looking forward to hearing from her on the subject. But before we get into that, we have a couple of polls for you all just to get an idea of who is in the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll, and you'll see it pop up on your screen. So it should have changed to that poll question. So go ahead and just click on the option that best describes the field that you work in. I'll leave this open for just about a minute and give you a heads up before I close it. All right, so I just closed that poll and I'm going to share the results with folks. I do want to note I'm seeing a few people write in that for some reason the poll isn't allowing them to answer, so I apologize for that technical issue. There are a few folks who wrote in noting that they're disability service provider and one in adult protection, and then we also have the results that I'm displaying for you all on the screen. So it looks like 70% of the folks who were able to answer are in adult protective services, 5% legal, 3% medical or mental health, 10% disability service providers, and 12% other. So thank you all so much for participating in that. And now I'm going to do one more poll before we get into the content. And so this question is, do you conduct consent evaluations within your role? And this is referring to formalized consent evaluations. I received an additional comment in the comments box, or the questions box, noting that this individual was able to vote after exiting full screen mode. So thank you for writing in that tip. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and then show the results. So most folks said that they do not, 69% said no, and 31% said yes. All right, so without further delay, I will now hand it off to you, Nora.
Hi, thank you, Karen. And I'm very excited to be able to present this talk with you. Actually, what I mean is talk with you, as there is a lot of information. Uh-oh, how does the Karen? Okay. And so this is such a sensitive topic, and it's fraught with all kinds of ethical and legal and moral and social aspects that I think it's really fun to do, because it is so challenging, and it does require, in my perspective, a team to work. So in the photo, you might want to guess which one I am. That's my sister, and that's me. A lot of people guess the one on the right because it's me, and I look like I'm probably trouble here. So consent to sex is our topic today. And the questions that are basically involved are: when is consent questioned? When does that even come up as an issue? And is it coming up when it should be, or is it overreach or underreach? Who is qualified to assess for consent? What determines consent, and what are the pitfalls of an erroneous conclusion? I'm going to see if I can move this over a little bit because I can't see all of my screen. Hang on a second. Okay. So consent is generally questioned when there's a suspicion of abuse or exploitation by a family member or other caregiver, when they learn of a plan or a history to engage sexually involving their adult child who has a developmental disability, and the caregiver believes that the individual cannot give consent. Of course, that's the opinion of the caregiver, and that may be over caring, or just not being aware that their adult child is able to give consent. It's also questioned when family members of the carers do not approve of the individual's chosen sex partner, or when there is a suspicion of undue influence of the sex partner over the individual with a disability, especially when the partner does not have a disability. And of course, care must be used in making this decision in terms of, can the individual learn through experience, or is this relationship plainly exploitative? And we can ask ourselves, who's never made an error in choosing or deciding on a sex partner? So we have to allow for some learning through experience, although we also want to make sure that the person is able to give consent. It's usually questioned when there is a petition for guardianship or conservatorship, and the right to make choices about sexual activity is being evaluated. And this is distinct from suspicions of sexual assault, where the victim reveals they were experienced a traumatic event of sexual contact or assault. But in general, there are not other times that it comes up. The first thing I want to do is review what are developmental disabilities and include some tips on some things that we should be aware of. There's a federal definition of developmental disability, and I've underlined the basic items of age. In some, for example, it's attributable to a mental or physical impairment or combination of both, and is manifested before the age of 22. Some states have different ages, like California, the age is 18, but the essence is that they have achieved the age of majority. The disability is likely to continue indefinitely, and results in substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of these areas of self-care, receptive and expressive language, ability to learn, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency, and reflects the individual's need for a combination and sequence of special interdisciplinary or generic services or supports or other assistance that are lifelong or extended duration, individually planned and coordinated. And then it talks a little bit about when people are younger and when the disability is suspected or discovered. Developmental disability is attributable to what used to be called mental retardation. This is California, now is referred to as intellectual disability as a result of Rosa's law, in which it was found that the use of the term mental retardation was becoming an expletive and needed to be changed to intellectual disability. Other disabilities include cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, or other handicapping conditions closely related to these major conditions, and constitutes a substantial disability for the individual. It doesn't include physical disorders not associated with a neurological impairment. Then we also have a definition by the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, where they use the age of 18 and talk about adaptive behavior and address intellectual functioning in terms of mental capacity, measuring intellectual functioning on an IQ test, usually around 70 or 75, and below indicates a limit in intellectual functioning. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The tricky part comes in adaptive behavior and measuring that, because I have seen in my time working with people that an IQ test score may indicate a certain level of adaptive behavior, but the individual actually seems to perform at a much higher level. So I always find it interesting to do a number of tests and assessments to see what their social awareness is, personal awareness, and ability to make choices that are good for themselves. And there's also conceptual skills. What is the level of language and literacy? Do they have an understanding of money and time and number concepts? Are they able to engage in self-direction? We look at social skills. We look at practicals, daily activity, living skills. Are they able to carry these out on their own? Do they understand why they engage in these activities? We'll look at occupational skills, healthcare, travel, transportation, schedules and routines, community safety, ability to use money, and their use of the telephone. These are all adult behaviors and skills, and it's important to look at their overall ability to participate in these adult activities. It's also interesting to know when the condition began, but it isn't necessary to doing this evaluation. So you want to know, as you're doing the work, what is the diagnosis of the individual, what are the activities of daily living they normally carry out, and what can they carry out independently, and which do they need support for. I like to know if the individual is able to make independent decisions about their finances, independent decisions at their job, and does someone have a power of attorney for the individual? If they have a power of attorney, that is most likely that the area of ability to make decisions regarding sexuality has already been adjudicated. In terms of communication, most individuals are verbal and hearing. However, some are nonverbal. important, the ability to speak is not related to intellectual ability or disability. So here we get into the issue of using adaptive and alternative communication methods, AAC, and what this involves are sometimes assisted technology methods such as computers. Assisted communication requires the support of a trained professional or the parent of the individual who's been trained to support that person in order for them to communicate. In other words, they may have a typer, or they may have a computer or a other computerized support, but they may not be able to use it on their own. So assisted communication is when they require the support of a trained communication support person. If possible, it's best not to use a parent as the support person during this assessment or other supportive assessments. The Americans with Disabilities Act supports the individual's right to be able to communicate in their usual manner. And if they need an interpreter, such as for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people who are blind, if needed for doing any evaluation. So just a quick review. Intellectual disability is measured by a combination of intelligence testing, academic performance, and adaptive skills. And here on the screen, you can see what the scores are. In general, I would say it is unlikely that people at the severe and profound levels of intellectual disability would be able to consent to sex and meet the criteria. Some people in the moderate level may also not be able. So we're really looking at more people who are in the borderline and mild ranges of intellectual disability. And again, that's not necessarily limited to just an IQ test, but looking at their community skills. I wanted to look at a few of the disabilities included under developmental disability, because this can affect how we conduct ourselves doing the evaluation. So autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is a developmental disability because it occurs, of course, during the developmental period and affects social communication and behavioral challenges. There's nothing about how people with ASD look that sets them apart from other people, but how they conduct themselves. So people with ASD or autism may communicate, interact, behave, and learn in ways that are different than most other people. Their thinking and learning and problem-solving abilities can range from gifted to severely challenged. Some people need a lot of help in their daily lives, and others need almost none, and some need none absolutely. So when we're interacting with people who have autism, it's important to understand that there are certain characteristics of them that have nothing to do with us. For example, they may not look at objects, or they may not look at us when we're talking to them. And that's not anything about us, it's just because that's how they are. They may not feel comfortable looking at you. They might not point at objects to show interest. They may have trouble relating to other people, or not demonstrate an interest in other people at all, as far as we understand it. But over time and learning about that person, they may be keenly aware of that other person. Many people with autism avoid eye contact with others. And when asked about it, some people have said that it's just too painful. It's too much information input. For a long time, we didn't know why that was, but we've learned a lot more over time. I've been doing this since 1984, so I've learned a lot along the way. Many times it appears people with autism prefer to be alone, and they seem to have trouble understanding other people's feelings or talking about their own feelings, which makes it a little bit more complex when we're doing this evaluation. They definitely prefer many. This is, of course, an overview, so doesn't apply to everybody, but you want to know what these are to not violate their preferences. So many prefer not to be held or touched. So it's best to avoid touching the individual. If they offer, for example, a handshake, then that's fine. But if they do not, then I wouldn't initiate one or touch the person at all during the evaluation. They may appear to be unaware when people are talking to them, but respond to other sounds. But what we've learned is that they may be keenly aware even when people are talking to them. They may be very interested in people, but not know how to talk or play or relate to them. They may echo words or phrases said to them, so that when you ask them a question, they may repeat the question. So it's important to give them time to process that they have echoed the question, and then they need time to process what that question was, what their answer is, and forming that answer. So sometimes it's important to give plenty of time for all of that to happen. They may have trouble expressing their needs using typical words or motions. They don't necessarily do pretend games. For example, they don't pretend to feed a doll, don't know what that's about, and they may repeat actions over and over again. Many people have trouble adapting to changes in a routine or change at all. So when you are coming into your evaluation room, it's important to leave time for them to get accommodated to the room, to point out what's in the room, to discuss what's going to be happening. And they may have unusual reactions to the way things smell, taste, look, feel, or sound. So in that vein, it's important not to wear any perfumes or aftershaves or anything that has an odor to it. Very important not to have fluorescent lighting in wherever it is that you are, because that can be very distracting and painful for them. Some can lose skills they once had. This happens more in early childhood, where the child talks and then loses their ability to speak, and then that may return or not return later in life. Some other interesting things about people with autism is a thing called interactional synchrony, and that is that there may be a longer delay than we're used to in speaking with another person. So for example, I might say to you, "Hi, how are you?" And you might say, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" However, for the person with autism, they may need time to hear and process what was said, and then develop an answer and then produce the answer. So it's important to give them the time they need to respond to a question that you may have said. It's important not to repeat the question, because of interactional synchrony. They may hear the question and they're in the process of processing it when then you say the question again. And then they hear that and then have to process that on top of the other. And it's like one record playing on top of another record, playing on top of another record. So patience is the word of the day. Needing time to change from one activity to another should be taken into consideration in your process of what we're going to do. So it would be really great to say, we are going to be going into a room, we are going to be talking together, going to be asking you some questions. So, and then when we complete, then we will exit, we'll come back, we'll find your parents, etc., and just walk them through what that is going to be for them. If they use communication boards, of course, they're going to need that during the evaluation. And I've had an experience where it was told that no, they have to do the evaluation on their own. They can't have a support person. Well, if you can't have a support person, you're not going to have an evaluation, because they need that individual to support them in their communication. Most people are verbal, however, so that's not going to be an issue. And we'd have to say there's many differences now among those who have autism as any other population. So the characteristics that I've given you may or may not apply in any given individual. Some although they may not have an intellectual disability, cannot carry out normal activities of daily living without support due to needing assistance with movement. Another developmental disability is cerebral palsy, which is basically a physical condition caused by brain damage, often at birth, but it can occur later, usually primarily affecting the body movement and muscle coordination. They may or may not have an intellectual disability, and there's several subtypes, and the condition may interfere with speech, so they may use talkers or computers or other kind of assistance. Epilepsy is the fourth most common neurological disorder, and it affects people of all ages, and it can begin at any age. Many people acquire epilepsy around the age of 18 or 19. Epilepsy is the same thing as seizure disorder, and is often, there are different kinds. Mostly people are on medication. The seizure can be triggered by stress. So knowing that this examination related to consent to sex could be stressful, and often is stressful, evaluators should know how to respond if their client does have a seizure during the assessment, and be prepared to take action if the person has a seizure. I wanted to address cultural aspects related to people with developmental disabilities. Many people during their school career have attended segregated special education programs, or and we're doing better with integration, but it's important to know that there may be things that they don't know because of that level of segregation. The next thing is they may have been raised with behavior modification methods that can interfere with independent thinking and choices and expression of choice. So that's one of the main things that I think we have to look at when we're doing this type of an evaluation, is if they have had an experience or they've been allowed to make choices, particularly personal choices in their own lives. But this is referred to basically as living in a culture of compliance, where compliance is rewarded over independent thinking and self-expression. So in doing the evaluation related to consent, we have to really examine what is their experience and being able to express their own wishes, desires, preferences. Another factor is that there is most often a lack of exposure to sufficient information about sexuality, about relationships, about dating, about choosing, about having the ability to make their own decisions in this regard, and making decisions whether if they are a positive decision or negative. Most people, of course, are growing up in their own family, and they see their siblings growing up and developing relationships with others, such as marriage, and then moving away from the parents, and understand that having a boyfriend or girlfriend is a mark of becoming an adult. However, during most of their life, there is a lack of experience in being able to say no to an adult that really means no. So they may not have been allowed to do this in their experience. Their no may not have been respected. So this is a result of behavior modification methods. And then on the flip side, becoming a girlfriend or boyfriend may be seen as a kind of badge of honor. In terms of sexuality, people with disabilities have the same range of appetite and onset of sexual maturity as others. The sexual maturity may be a little bit delayed. Some are not fertile because of the disability, so that's kind of important to know if they have that condition when we're doing this evaluation. In some disabilities, sexual appetite is identified as heightened or reduced. So looking at the literature, you can see that people with certain kinds of disabilities are basically known to have a higher sexual appetite. It's my experience that most people, in terms of sexual differences, they don't receive an appropriate or adequate sexuality education on sexual anatomy, on the sexual system, as well as on the reproductive system, and or legal restrictions to sex. Sex education might just be restricted to the reproductive system and may or may not include the laws, the ethics, morality issues, or social customs or prescriptions that we are now examining them to see if they understand. So it's important to know if they've had any exposure to this information at the time, prior to the time they come in for an assessment. Some other differences: sexual conduct of children and adults with disabilities are viewed differently than those without disabilities. This might result in arrest or incarceration, conviction or diversion or jail sentences if there is sexual conduct that looks like it is willful assault on another person. Accusations of child abuse can result, and I have an example here, this many years ago, and it has more to do with the attitudes of other people, but this was a boy around 17. He had a newspaper run where he would deliver newspapers, and everybody knew him, and was sitting on the porch of one of his customers, and their little 3-year-old girl came out, 2 or 3-year-old girl, and he patted her on the behind, on her diapers, and on the butt. And the mother saw this happen from inside the house and called the police, and he was arrested for sexual assault. I think that his behavior was what people do a lot, what I've done myself. But because of the disability and the mother's terror that he was a pervert and a predator, he was arrested. He actually then was removed from that job. He was removed from his home and put in placement, all because of that one action. There was really nothing sexual about it. There's other differences, that there's humiliation or embarrassment, or traumatic experiences for the individual and the family, such as the one that I just mentioned to you. And then we have to look at an evaluation of the ability to consent to sex. There's other sexual differences. So these perceptions are based on myths, stereotypes, and inaccurate assumptions that those in charge of managing reports of sexual conduct may be subject to some of these myths or stereotypes. So we have to be careful in terms of taking a history of what actually happened. In the area of prejudices of lay population, there are many who believe that people with disabilities, just in general, are likely to be sex maniacs or wild sexual marauders, unable to control their urges, and need caging or being supervised at all times. And this came up no less than 10 years ago, that a group home was being planned in Riverside County, and the neighborhood all objected on this particular belief that all of their children would be endangered by these sexual marauders. That's where I got the word. If there is inappropriate conduct, normally it's because of no adequate prior information being provided about sexuality, and or what I call age discordant exploration. The individual perceives himself or herself as a younger person. And I think this also needs to be taken into consideration if there is inappropriate genital sharing, for example, or looking at genitals, or let me see yours and I'll show you mine, between, say, a 19-year-old and a 9-year-old. The 19-year-old may not understand that this is not normal exploration with a peer, because that person may see themselves as a 9-year-old. Sexual differences, all of those responding to such conduct or reports receive educational programs regarding people with developmental disabilities, as other people do. That's not true. People with disabilities do not really receive the information that they need. I recommend using the rules of sex for people who have been arrested for behavior that they never knew was against the law, because nobody really taught them what against the law is. I think that sex ed programs that include information about sexual conduct and social relationships, information on the sexual system as well as the reproductive system, and positive relationship building and supports and supportive decision-making skills is really essential. In doing the evaluation, you want to know what is the history of the individual to mastering sexuality information. Each state has laws on what sex education should be provided, and most include an opportunity for parents to have their child opted out of the sex education program. And so it's important to know if they have had a history of being taught what are the rules of sex, what is sexuality, etc. In terms of determining consent for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, each state has its own statutory language to discriminate between consensual and non-consensual. So it's important to, as evaluators, to know what is the state, what are the state laws that we're working under. Most of these laws identify age, consciousness, and ability to understand the nature and consequences of the act, of the sexual act. Some states also require an understanding of the moral and social consequences related to engaging sexually with another adult. Also, there's language regarding threat. Is there a perceived or real threat? Was there use of weapon and force? And also, there's not uniformity of criteria among the states on this. So, and there's no accepted assessment instrument to measure consent to sex. The elements of consent need to be evaluated. So most definitions include, does the requisite knowledge exist in the individual to make a decision? So there's a couple of things. Is this the appropriate time, place, person, and lawfulness of the activity? Can the person...
I couldn't hear what you said.
Can the person... Can the person demonstrate that their participation was fully voluntary? And did they participate without coercion or undue influence? I always look for payment. Was there some sort of payment involved? It could be candy, it could be money, in terms of this undue influence. Does the person demonstrate a reasoned understanding and weigh the risks and benefits of the sexual engagements? And in some states, does the person appreciate the moral quality of their sexual activity? Not every state has that, but where it exists, then that, of course, needs to be examined. Most states have laws that those with significant cognitive disabilities may be incapable of legally consenting to a sex act. There may be an option to provide support to help the individual achieve or understand the nature and consequences of the sexual conduct, so that, like, for people who have committed sex crimes, they may be mandated to a program where they learn what are the laws in regard to the sex crimes and what are the rights of people on how they've been violated, and then they can be kind of reconstituted and able to provide the correct answers and understand. Now, it may be possible that an individual going through a program can understand more about sexuality and more about choice and more about autonomy and more about whether or not how to measure, do they want to engage sexually with an individual. And also the instruction would include what is the nature of the act of sex or the natures of the acts of sex, and what are the consequences of sexual conduct. In most states, the criteria for achieving ability to consent includes the knowledge of sexual activity, what is unlawful sexual activity, and what are appropriate times and places for sexual activity. An analysis of the individual's freedom to choose to engage sexually. Can they resist the coercion or influence of whatever level? And do they understand the consequences? And what determines consent? An evaluation of the whole person should be conducted, including the intellectual ability to understand sexual matters, their ability to make choices and informed choices, and their ability to express these choices, and whether or not those choices are respected, I think is very important in matters other than sexuality. The individual's ability to resist undue pressure, social pressure, to please another person, notwithstanding the usual expectation to agree or go along with other people, which has been most likely a lifetime pattern. So being able to resist pressure, light pressure or more heavy pressure, is something that should be explored, and how that works normally in their day-to-day life. For example, if they don't want to have spinach and they say, I don't want to have spinach, and they're told, well, because our nurse says you have to have spinach, you're going to have spinach. Their ability to resist and to maintain what they want or don't want is obviously compromised. Okay, so capacity to consent. The laws regarding factors to consider vary among the states, as you know. And we're looking at voluntariness, which we just referenced, and understanding the possible consequences. So the capacity to consent to sex can vary over time, from incapable due to knowledge deficits, but then later with training and education, this can be remedied and may later result in a finding of capacity. So that's a possible option that can be taken before a final decision related to capacity to consent is completed. The presumption of capacity is a concept that exists, that every adult has capacity to consent to sex. But obviously this has to be amended when the person is clearly not able, for example, those in the profound and maybe the severe ranges of intellectual disability, or this is examined in a court proceeding when a petition for guardianship or conservatorship has been filed and is being adjudicated. However, it is possible that not a thorough examination of the ability to consent to sex is done in these particular court proceedings. So it's important to look and see if those were done, if there was a petition for guardianship. Presumption of capacity is also considered when this person is alleging that the person was a victim of sexual assault, where in fact the individual may not consider themselves a victim at all, but rather in a relationship or having made their independent decision without the understanding that there are other factors that have led to their being in a sexual relationship with that individual. in terms of allegation of sexual abuse, you have to determine if the sexual act was voluntary on the part of the individual, and did they have capacity to consent to sex. So the nature of the conduct, what is the sex act, or what are the sex acts? That's the nature. Voluntariness is, did you want to do it before you did it? And did you want to do it with X person and at X location and at that time?
Hi,
So
Nora.
this is where,
Sorry for interjecting. This is Karen. Would you like to do the other polls?
oh, sure, that's a great time to do this right now.
Okay, great. So we do have 2 more polls we're going to do right in a row. I'm going to launch the first one for you all. It's just like last time. You can just click on the option to indicate your answer. I'll leave this open for maybe 30 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and then show the results. So it looks like we have 23% of folks who answered saying yes, and I did receive a message in the questions box, someone answering yes as well, and then 77% said no. And then one more question. I'll launch this next poll, and I'll leave this open for 30 to 45 seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share those results. I realized that I was on mute when I was speaking switching between those last 2 polls, so I apologize for that. The answers to this one, we had 69% of folks who were able to answer saying yes and 31% saying no. I did also receive a couple of comments in the questions box for both questions notifying the answer yes, that they were unable to answer the poll. Thank you all so much for participating, and I'll hide that now so we can get back to the screen.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So the nature of the conduct, of course, is what is the sex act or the sex acts. That is the nature. And did you want to do it before you did it? Voluntariness. And did you want to do it with X person and at X location and X time? And I just want to, make a quick comment that before a person's very first sexual experience, I think it's difficult to say that we had a full understanding of what the sex act actually was. It's one thing to see it on, cartoons on a screen or a diagram. Many people with disabilities don't actually understand a diagram in the first place. And of course, we're not showing the sex act in sex ed. But I think that has also needs to be considered. And what are the negative consequences of the sexual act? Obviously, unwanted pregnancy, an acquisition of a sexually transmitted disease, sense of entrapment, sense of obligation. And is the individual aware of these consequences, including pregnancies and STDs, and how to prevent them? Were they aware prior to the sexual act or acts that are under consideration? What I find interesting is that these do not inquire about the emotional impact of the sexual activity upon the individual. That is, how do they feel about having engaged sexually with a particular person? And although not required, it's important to ask because I think it provides us important information about how they are psychologically affected by having engaged sexually and now being in trouble related to that sexual engagement with the individual. They may feel relieved because they didn't really like doing that. On the other hand, they may feel that they're not allowed to be a grown-up like their siblings. In some states, there's morality issues that have to be considered in order to assess their consent to sex. And so the first is the sexual conduct or activity acceptable to that individual? But I would also want to ask about how their siblings or how their family members have discussed this or received this information, or what have they taught them related to morality and sexuality. Also, if what happens regarding forced sex, did the person agree to sex due to social pressure or offer of a bribe or money or candy, etc.? Was there physical force, and did the individual attach some importance to it, some moral import, or social import as well? Substitute decision making is addressed in some of the literature on addressing consent to sex. However, in other matters, other than sex, conservators and guardians can offer substitute consent, but I don't think so for sexuality. However, that has been done, so we need to look at that, and that would be a whole other legal matter. And here in this slide, I wanted to introduce make sure that I mentioned trafficking by parents or other individuals who've gained control of the person with a disability and convinced that person with a disability that this is something that's okay. And so that is something that I don't see a lot in the literature, but I certainly do in doing my work with the Disability and Abuse Project and problems of trafficking of people with disabilities for the purpose of sex or sometimes for work. So when is consent questioned? When an individual states that he's been a victim of rape or has a disability, I'm sorry, I meant and has a disability, or when an individual with a developmental or other disabilities discovered to have had sexual interaction, or the individual's ability to consent appears to be compromised and a complaint is filed, or with not a legal complaint perhaps, but maybe a legal complaint, or is brought up for discussion in the social services realm. When should consent be questioned? When any individual with developmental disability states he's been involved in a relationship, or when they have a disability, or when they're elderly, or whenever they say that they want to have sex, is that the time before sexual activity occurs that consent should be assessed? And that there's just not clarity about when this should be addressed formally. I've seen this done as a condition of admission into residential care, or as a matter of procedure for anyone with a disability to receive social services. But I think that we have to be very careful about when we start addressing things as a problem without the appropriate support. So if there is a person who has a developmental disability and they say that they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they seem to be doing well, I'm not sure that it's appropriate to necessarily have an assessment, a formal assessment. Who is qualified to assess consent to sex? Well, according to the laws in your state, In most states, it would be a person with the appropriate education, background, and training with this population, and an understanding of measuring consent in other areas, such as a psychologist or social worker or psychiatrist or other designated professional. If the person holds a certification as a sex educator, counselor, or therapist, I think this is a plus, since these matters of sexuality and being able to easily discuss sexual matters is made much easier with this background. However, there is no one designated professional category, which is why I love teams. So a team of qualified individuals participate in the outcome. Probably just one person would be best, to have just one person doing the assessment, but examining the results and coming to a determination. I love team, and I think that it makes a lot of sense to have various people join in the decision. What are the pitfalls of an erroneous conclusion? Well, one is that if a consent question is determined forever, for example, of course, rather than on a case-by-case basis, an individual usually able to consent could be decreed unable ever to consent, and then all future partners would be involving criminal law and sexual assault. So I think that we just have to be really careful about making that decision. And then again, can the individual be habilitated to achieve capacity to consent to sex, like the CAST program for people with developmental disabilities who committed sex crimes? There should be an ability to habilitate the individual and then review the assessment. So the quick background on the assessment is, did they know they were going to have sex, and did they want to? And how much mastery of human anatomy and physiology is required to know if you really want to be sexual with another person? And, you know, sometimes I think about, well, you know, what about people who, to native and illiterate populations who may not know about fallopian tubes or anatomy and physiology and laws and all of that? Is it fair to impose a higher standard on people who have a developmental disability than those who don't, for example? So I just use that as a point in reference to, are we asking for something more than what we do for people who do not have a disability? The same is true for their understanding of community and social living or standards. How much personal or physical autonomy is needed for the person to know their sexual desires and attractions? And then finally, who decides what partner another person may have? So I know that in families, often one family member does not like the chosen partner of other family members, but the person who's partnered with that person really likes them. So we want to avoid those kinds of judgments that, oh, such a creep, or I don't like him, but she loves him. So that also needs to be taken into consideration, I think. So you want to make sure that you match the ability and the culture and knowledge base of the individual. And if they're not equipped, then we don't want to fail the person or fail to answer that question. Administration of supportive evaluations, like the IQ or the SSSQ or activities of daily living, are not a substitute for direct question about the event. However, in the past, some evaluators have used this SSSQ, Street Survival Skills Questionnaire, that doesn't address sexuality at all, and then coming to a decision related to consent to sex. So I think we want to make sure that we're using the appropriate tools to address that question. Again, some of the cultural inhibitors to being able to consent to sex are do as you're told, which is what they basically live with in every environment in which they live. It's rare to find people who are skilled in assertion training skills and are able to use it in their daily living. So I think that this is a confounding factor when we're looking for consent to sex. Violation of following the rules often results in loss of privileges, reprimand, public shaming, but in combination with reward for compliance. Another cultural thing is other people are allowed to disagree with adults, so to speak, but not the person with an intellectual disability. The lack of adequate sex education is difficult. And I say sexuality is complicated and hard to understand really before the first sexual experience. And there seems to be absent a right to make bad choices and learn by experience. A lot of us have made good choices, bad choices in various things, and we learn by experience. So I think that we need to be able to think about that as we're doing these assessments. Characteristics that influence the ability to understand our history of abuse, which I think would contribute to agreeing to have sex even though they may not want to. So I call that undue pressure, undue influence, contributed to by history of abuse. And I think that builds a stronger assessment when this is evaluated. If there has been exposure to pornography, at what time, by whom, and how. And sex education, you really want to find out what that sex education program was, what was covered, how much of it was understood by the individual. A high social value on having an individual, having a partner, a boyfriend like other family members do is really strong. People don't want to be seen as a victim or to lose status as the girlfriend or having a boyfriend. In many cases, they don't want to lose their partner and they don't want to be single again and kind of wait for the next opportunity. So in the literature, what are the sex acts? Vagina-penis intercourse, penis-anus intercourse, oral intercourse. And there's a reference to private body parts. I tend to think that all of the body belongs to the individual. So I refer to these more as sexual body parts because I think all of the body should be considered belonging to the individual. Can the individual say or indicate consent, yes or no, to anything? And does the individual understand they can refuse sexual activity? So the individual must understand the risks of pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and understand what causes a pregnancy, why condoms are used, and what are sexually transmitted diseases or conditions. So totality of the circumstances, the relationship between the parties, location of the sexual act in question, the victim's educational background, level of independence, how did the people meet, and was there an element of secrecy regarding the sexual activity? And of course, we have to know what is the law in the state in which we are working. In conducting the evaluation, we have to be very careful about, frankly, discussing and initiating a conversation about a socially proscribed discussion. So it's important to understand that there may be cultural prohibitions for this, but we also need to prepare ourselves for engaging in discussions that are fraught with embarrassment, perhaps, or at least discomfort. However, what we found is the evaluator's ease in discussing these matters contributes to the interviewee's ability to feel at ease as well. I'd like to ask, what do you call this body part? And then use the term used by the interviewee, as well as the medical term commonly used. Some people may use baby talk, like their wee-wee, for example, which can be used in initially, I think, in respect to the individual. And you can say, yeah, and another word for that is their penis or whatever, or their labia, whatever they're referring to. In conducting the assessment, it's essential to use plain English and adapt the interview to the person's disability-related background, making sure they understand they're not in trouble, understanding that the purpose of the interview is to make sure that they are safe. And while you understand that the individual's chronological age may not match their maturational age. In doing the interview, it's important to avoid abstract concepts, making the questions as concrete as possible. I think in some cases it's important to use anatomical dolls to understand the person's anatomically detailed dolls to learn the person's understanding of body parts, as some people cannot understand a two-dimensional representation. So showing them a drawing is not going to work, but using a doll makes it a lot easier. If you're asking about a specific event, know that when asked, the individual may tell their story if you ask them about it in reverse chronological order. You might say, tell me what happened, and their story begins with, we had sex, rather than I met him on the corner. It's recommended to use one concept per questions and avoid questions that may result in an I don't know answer, because developing an I don't know pattern of responses can cause negative feelings. Usually the individual wants to please the interview and do well during the interview. They may not have a concept of time, how long, but they may know from what time to what time. So for example, if a young woman went to meet her partner, you want to know ask what time, not at what time did you leave, what time did you begin would be easiest, and use simple sentences. And they may not want to say that they don't understand the question. So if you see some hesitance, you may want to self-apologize and say, oh, let me make that a little clearer. The individual may not want to say the words because they know that there's shame or embarrassment around it. So you might as well just use the words or terms that they use. And know that perpetrators groom their victims to establish emotional currency or loyalty and reduce this chance of discovery, encouraging, this is our secret. So I like asking about secrets. Did somebody want to have a secret with you? And also building self-esteem. So the perpetrator may say, you're an adult now, you don't have to tell your parents. So these are some questions that you could ask. So there's no clear legal standard of cognitive ability to establish consent to sex. Some people at the severe range may be able to distinguish and express choice in personal matters, but they're so different, each person one from the other. So there is that. And then some individuals may appear to understand, but in fact, they're unable to resist commands and pressure by perpetrators. And some people will never be able to understand sexual touch or interaction due to the severity of their disability, as we said at the beginning. So making a determination must include the consequences of a determination that the individual is unable to consent to sex. In that case, the person will never be able to engage in a romantic or sexual relationship during their lifetime. Your state may identify professionals qualified to assess capacity to sex. Consider that the gender of the assessor may have an effect on the ease of the participation of the subject, so it's best to match gender if possible, and explain to the individual being assessed the purpose of the evaluation, the possible impact on their life. I like this quote that individuals with mental impairments deserve capacity assessments that accurately reflect their psychological capabilities, respect their sexual rights, and protect them from sexual abuse. In New York, you take a broad view of what should one be capable of understanding. In this particular case, that you have to understand not only the physical consequences, such as sexually transmitted diseases and pregnancy, but also the moral consequences of sex. In other words, appreciation of how their behaviors might be judged by others in order to have capacity to engage with them. While there are several tools of assessing consent to sex, there's no one instrument that enjoys general acceptance. And this may be in part due to the fact of the variation in laws across the states. Here's an example that I wanted to share with you in terms of consent to sex. This is a couple over 18 years of age. He has autism, she has Tourette syndrome. The complaint, they decided to have sex because they were boyfriend and girlfriend. They'd had sex before. During the sex act, she asked him to stop. He could not stop in the middle of the sex act. So later she reported to law enforcement that she had been raped. What had to be considered was what we said at the very beginning of this talk, is that people with autism often need a lot of time to prepare for change from one activity to the next. And in preschools and even up into the high school ages, time is allotted for preparation, from moving from, for example, eating breakfast to getting dressed. A warning, okay, now we're getting dressed. In about 5 minutes, the bus is going to be coming. Okay, in about 3 minutes, the bus is going to be coming. So preparation time. He was not able, because of his autism, to suddenly switch from having sex to stopping. So the question for the court was that rape or was that not rape? Here's another example of a young woman living at her parents' home, graduated from high school, working at her father's office. She can take the bus home on her own. She was invited on a date by a customer of the dad's business, but was advised not to tell her parents. This is our little secret. The man was 30 years older than the woman and told her to keep his visits to the family home a secret, that grown-ups do sex things together. So there we have this kind of influence that this is what grown-ups do, and they don't tell their parents about what they're doing. But the parents found out, and the evaluation found her primary knowledge of sex was the experience with this man. She did as he was told. She did not have love for him or desire to marry. So what she understood, however, was that she was being asked out and she was getting attention, and she liked it. And she did not like what happened when it was discovered. Another one was a young woman with a family who lived in a trailer park, and told by a neighbor she could come over for a visit, during which times he had sex with her. He gave her candy and told her to keep this a secret. This keeping it a secret is a huge matter and very revealing. And for me, it reveals that the so-called boyfriend knew that what he was doing was not correct. Many years ago, I developed an instrument I called FACS, Forensic Assessment of Consent to Sex, that's designed to be used by a multidisciplinary team, administered by one person, and was originally designed for people with developmental disabilities. So I just want to quickly go through some of these questions. We wanted to look at the nature of the consequences of the act. So I've said before, we need to develop rapport, administer a declaration of understanding, the difference between a truth and a lie, which may not be necessary in your state. And so this was of a woman who lived 22 years old at an ICF-DDH-MR and had moderate mental retardation. The sister was her conservator and really didn't understand anything about the whole court procedure. ICF-DDMR refused to provide the sex education curriculum they said had been administered, so we never were able to learn about that. So what I did, she was walking down the hallway one day with her blouse kind of unbuttoned, and staff learned that she'd been out with her boyfriend. They called 911, and then it resulted in an assessment of consent to sex. The boyfriend was employed at a local department store, had been arrested and incarcerated because of the discovery of sex between the two of them. Of course, the penalty would be heavy. So I put her answers in green because I want to go through this very quickly. So understanding the act, she said it was putting a penis into a woman's vagina and somebody touches you. Uh-oh. Why do people have sex? I thought her answers were pretty good. What can you tell me when nobody else can see you? What are the rules? It's okay to have sex, but not where I live. I thought that was interesting. Who usually has sex together? A boyfriend and girlfriend, husband, wife. What's the meaning? Means you're normal. So there we are again with that wish to be normal. It feels good. It shows you love someone. So do you have to have sex? Only if you want to. What do people feel after they feel happy? I thought that was pretty good. What can happen after? They want to do it again. The woman can get pregnant, but not me because he wore the rubber penis and I take a pill. So she understood that. May not be exactly on point, but it was her understanding. So what happened? She understood she was going on a date. And what happened that made it occur? Why did you go? Because we had a date. Did you want it to stop? Yes, she said at one point he was doing it too hard. So what did you do? Well, I told him to make it softer, and he did. And then she really enjoyed the sex, which I thought was much better than a lot of women that I've worked with. And what do you call what he did to you? We were doing it, making love, you know. So I was pretty convinced that she understood what she was about to do. She'd done it before. She enjoyed it. So I asked her if she could have sex with him again. She didn't know because I don't want him to go to jail again. And would you like to have sex with a different person? I don't know, maybe. So what I'd like to do right now is to invite questions. I have a few more slides, but I'm just going to go through them very quickly. You can read them. We like to pretend we were boyfriend and girlfriend. Couldn't get pregnant because of he was using the rubber penis and she took a pill. He says that he does not have a disease, so obviously they discovered that. So Karen, I don't know if, I'm sorry, my assessment was she understood what the act was, the nature, the consequences. She was going on a date. She had consented to sex. She liked him a lot. She liked that he was normal, didn't have a disability, but she knew he wasn't available as a full-time boyfriend because of his marriage. And she knew and was on good terms with the wife. Okay, those are complicating factors. Also, she had taken the sex ed class. She had an understanding of the matters of sex, and she met her boyfriend when he had been an employee at her home. Uh-oh, another complication. So here's where law might clash with norms or moral issues, which we don't have in California, but I don't think that these should be applied uniformly only to people with disabilities. So that's another issue. So I think that this instrument can be used when there's a forensic reason to do so and should be administered by a qualified forensic mental health specialist. And the results are best determined, in my opinion, by team and understanding the culture of disability. So thank you so much. If there's questions right now, I would like to take them. Karen.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nora. We do have a few questions that came in. This first one, it seems like it may be specific to a case. It says, does a 21-year-old male have the right to give consent for sex with his court-appointed guardian? So I think the point of the question is asking, can an individual consent to have sex with their guardian?
Wow. Well, it depends on what the court has said. Since they have a guardian, if the individual has been adjudicated as unable to consent to sex, you can't do substitute consent to sex. So I would say no.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just scanning through. So it's along those same lines, but there was a question that was asked. Did Nora say if one already has a power of attorney or other adjudicated conservator slash guardian that their ability to consent to sex has already been determined, would this have to be specified within their legal paperwork?
I would think so. Yes, absolutely. I have a very short answer for that. Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
I like the point that, absolutely.
The next question was, how do you factor in the difference between ability and ability if afforded the ability to resist undue pressure, to sustain and know?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
The question was, how do you factor in the difference between ability and ability if afforded I think a better word maybe would be opportunity to resist undue pressure or to sustain a no in answering?
Ah, I think that the ability, you're talking actually kind of about assertion skills and melting under pressure. Is that right?
I believe so.
Is that what it looks like?
Yes, I believe so.
Right. So then that would, for me, I would discuss that with a team, of course, but I would go to undue pressure, which I don't think exists as a legal concept, but undue influence certainly does. And pressuring somebody to have sex is not is something that should be part of the sexual decision making. If there's, I would say that if there's pressure, then that is something that should be evaluated or discussed. Maybe assertion skills, but again, as I said, in assertion skills, most people are not allowed to have their assertion skill actually honored. So again, that's going back to building that skill and building that practice in the individual, whether it's related to sex or not. But I would, of course, if I was doing a sex ed program, I would talk about pressures and that they come in many ways: verbal pressure, threats, payment. I was mentioning the woman earlier who was getting candy and then she didn't get her candy and she was pissed off. But she also didn't like the sex and she had been told not to talk about it. So I think that these matters of undue influence take many, many different forms.
All right, thank you. The next question is, what if the individual has a guardian and the individual appears to have capacity to consent, understands the consequences, and has knowledge, but the guardian disagrees and does not want the individual to engage in sexual relations? And they provided some context. This would be in a situation where the individual is higher functioning, but still requires guardian for placement, financial, and medical decisions.
Okay, well, in a guardianship, normally, or at least in California, the question of whether or not they are capable of making their own decisions regarding sex is included. And so that's already been adjudicated. So you would have to go back into the guardianship or conservatorship papers to see if the individual's decisions to engage in sex or not has been removed. If that person is no longer legally able to decide, then they cannot make that decision on their own. That decision is that of the guardian.
All right, thank you. The next question is, it says, increased awareness of implicit bias in our society. How might implicit bias of people with IDD come into play? What do you recommend to address this issue to ensure that assessments are not unduly biased by unexamined attitudes, beliefs, prejudice against people with IDD?
That's a brilliant question. I love that question. And that's also why I really love team, because I think that we can help censor each other by identifying that maybe that's not a fact, maybe that's an attitude, maybe that's not a fact, maybe that's a prejudice, and examine where those comments come from and maybe increase information about that. But when we're doing this on our own, then our own prejudices or, beliefs, I think, come into play. And although there's not legislation about it, that's why I love teams, because we can help support each other, but we can also censor things, because I've seen evaluations which I thought were absolutely incorrect because of such a thing, pre-existing prejudices against being able to make this decision. I think that would be a great seminar for our next NAPSA conference.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. So the next question, could you explain a bit more about the CAST program?
About the what program?
It says the CAST program, C-A-S-T.
Oh, it's not a program. It's an assessment instrument that I developed years ago to address the question of consent to sex. It's not validated. It is, what I did was I just followed the law and what were the matters that were had to be considered when making a decision about whether or not the individual understood the nature and consequences of the act and whether it was volitional. I was wanting to look at issues of payment, obviously, since that's been one of the issues that comes up frequently. So really having to do with, was there free will, and did the person understand the nature and consequences of the act, and how it also relates to standing, because there are people, of course, who have disabilities, who having a sex partner, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, raises their esteem socially in their eyes. Now I've joined the regular group, right? Now I'm a part of normal adult society. I have a girlfriend, I have a boyfriend. So if there's undue influence there, that's what needs to be looked at. The other thing, sort of along that line, is that people with developmental disabilities whose right to make this decision has not been removed or removed yet, make a decision for a partner that nobody likes in the family, because that person, whether it's a male or female, is just too something, or sometimes they use drugs, they don't have a job, all of the kinds of things, like, I just don't like your partner and I think that he's not good for you. Where do we come down there on, okay, you can't make a decision on your own about which sex partner, but you do seem to have enough information about what sex is and whether or not you can engage sexually. So it gets messy. It's messy when trying to make such an intimate, personal decision for another person. The issue really is are they in danger of exploitation? And that's where the line is really supposed to come.
Great, thank you. All right, to be mindful of time, I'm going to read one more question and then wrap it up. Sorry if you heard that, that was my dog. So the last question I'll read for today is, if people don't have all the requisite knowledge or skills at the time, is the recommendation ever made to afford information and experience to gain the requisite knowledge?
Yes, I think that we are advancing in that direction. So as I mentioned, like the SSSQ for the social skills, I think that we're starting to look at providing information through sex education programs for people with developmental disabilities, who then may be able to understand a great deal more. Like the issues related to moral questions, I'm not really sure that in sex ed programs in schools, moral questions are defined or described or later understood by the individual. It's not a requirement in every state, but I really like the idea of developing with an individual what are their sexual values, how many partners do I want to have in my lifetime? What kind of a person would I want to engage sexually with and have as a sex partner or lover or boyfriend or marriage even? So I think that if we should be looking at what you could call a habilitative training course in sex ed that directly addresses what the law says is a requirement in that state, but also adding ability to choose, assertion skills, judgment, what makes a good partner, what doesn't make a good partner, things like that.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation and for answering these questions. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking your time to learn with us today. The recording will be posted likely early next week, so you all can access that to look through it, or if you have colleagues who are interested in joining and weren't able to today, they can access that there. But otherwise, thank you again so much for your time. Thank you, Nora. This was wonderful, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.